We are here in order to present this book that has been by the net of history museums and urban research centers of Europe. And Tim Marshall has been the person who has coordinated the preparation of the book. Tim Marshall is Professor Emeritus of Planning at Oxford Brookes University. His research interests include planning at regional and national scales and planning major infrastructure in the United Kingdom and Europe, as well as the long histories of cities and the role of public and collective action in steering cities. His more recent book is The Politics and Ideology of Planning, 2020. It's very, very recent. And he will present us this work that has been published with the cooperation of MUBA, of the History Museum of Barcelona. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Is that working, the system? Can you hear the microphone okay? Yeah. Okay, well, good evening. We should be joined by the other editor, Joan Rocco, quite soon, I believe, but we're being accompanied by a few people who are watching this, I think authors of different chapters on the streaming. So we want to get moving, and Joan will be able to join us when he arrives. What I want to do this evening is give you an idea of the book, fairly obviously. Before that, I'll just give some impression of where it comes from, which Johan might have done in his presentation, but I'll do now. And I'm also going to exploit my position as presenter to say a few personal words of background, to see why, to explain to you really, many of you would not know, although possibly the people on the streaming call may know why I'm involved with this. So I hope your English is good. Si voleu després fer preguntes en català, no hi ha problema, però hem de traduir, evidentment, per la gent que estan allà fora en el streaming. So this comes out, as has been said, from a city history network from around Europe, says Joan, and the people in Amsterdam Museum in 2010 set up a collaborative network. The idea is really to compare notes, to exchange ideas about running city museums across Europe with selected members of museums and also some academics who sort of outside viewpoint. They're people who work mainly in museum studies or related areas from different European countries. I joined in a bit later on simply because I know Joan, so there's no mystery really about that. But there were 8 meetings between 2010 and 2019, and there's for obvious reasons, a slight pause, and then a final meeting, a further meeting, not final, at the end of last year of the networks, meeting always in Barcelona, and always a sort of collaborative couple of days of meetings and discussions. It was decided a little while ago it'd be good to get a book which represents the work of the network, and that's what you're here to see today, which has been put together by authors either involved in the network in most cases, or 1 or 2 people who are alongside it, as it were. And so, as this slide says, and I won't be speaking all the time to the words on slides, which can get a bit boring, but there'll be quite a lot of images as well. The task now will be to make the book useful, get the distribution moving. It's still a very important topic, I think, because the challenges which I describe with Joanne's help in the introduction, are getting no easier than they were for city museums. There's lots of political challenges, technological, digital, all sorts of issues thrown up by the pandemic, which have generated learning, but also difficulties for some museums around Europe. And so we think, and I'm sure Joanne would have said this at the beginning, that this remains an important contribution to the debate about what city museums, city history museums can do. So I'm going to say a few personal words. I hope this will be relatively linking into the linking into the themes of the book, but it does come from my own personal background. I'm a planner, a town and country planner in English terms. That's a urbanist more or less in Southern Europe, or a city planner. And my view, and it's still a view, but there's a view I had at the beginning, which I've sort of tested to some extent, is that city planning and city museums have some overlaps, some commonalities. If you look at some of the adjectives on this slide, territorial, transversal, by transversal I mean sort of going across fields of society and of culture in the widest sense, collective and collaborative, both planning and museums have some of those features. They deal with similar sorts of things: housing, provisioning, moving, infrastructures, ecology are all at the heart of planning as it stands in the way that we do it in Britain anyway, or the way we should do it. And so is there a natural affinity between planning and museums? Question mark. Two examples I just wanted to give you, which I say this is not in the book, this is me, but I think it relates to the issue quite well. There's two men in the early 20th century who definitely thought that planning and museums were strongly linked. One of them is called Patrick Geddes, who is was a Scottish biologist, but above all a city planner who more or less invented parts of the planning intellectual effort, a book called Cities in Evolution. But he was also obsessed with museums, and he wrote articles about museums, one published in 1906, arguing the case for what he called a civic museum, a sort of citizen museum probably is the word we'd use now. And he pursued this all his life. He was a very active planner, worked all over the place, including in India in the end, the British Empire. And always he promoted the importance of exhibitions, planning exhibitions, and of trying to improve museums. The second man who is of that early 20th century period is from Otto Neurath from Vienna. And he was a philosopher and social scientist, but he also had an obsession, or not obsession, but a strong interest in museums. He had, because Vienna had so many languages, it wasn't a purely German-speaking city, there was heaps of languages. He said that this phrase, words divide but pictures unite, and he was very keen on developing images. And so, first of all, he set up a museum, 1923, the Siedlungsmuseum, Housing and Planning Museum, was changed to the title of Society and Economy Museum 2 years later, and it was run by an association represented by the city council, the trade unions, and the workers' groups. Remember, this was a point of strong left-wing leadership of Vienna at this stage, and Neurath was part of that. And he thought that in order to have a functioning democracy, you need to have good communication, and educated citizenry, and really to have a socialism, which was what the goal was of the city council in Vienna. You needed an educated, a functioning democracy, and in order to do that, you can. I got a missing image. That's a pity. It's a rather nice image. He set up a way of using images called isotype, which you can Google later and pick up some of these images that I don't know what's happened to this. It was a rather nice image of a Soviet 1932 representation of Spain, but they use represent by image, by sort of figures. And say populations will be a whole lot of people standing up, you know, so the female numbers of a population, the male numbers. Anyway, this is much used now, but in the 1920s it was a new idea. And the isotype sort of process has affected a lot of sort of design since then. And 100 years on, the museum is still there in Vienna, and you can look at the website and see that this idea of producing civic, socially oriented museums has been quite popular among. I mean, Neurath was not a planner in the specific sense. He was a planner in a much more general sense of a social and economic planning. So the answer to my question, is there an affinity between town planning and city museums? Probably not very directly, but there is, I think, a sort of subterranean set of connections, and that's probably one reason why I'm interested in helping on this project, which really I've done to some extent from the sidelines, because I've never worked in a museum myself. So let's go to the book, and I hope the authors who are watching on the streaming will not have complaints about what I'm going to say about the chapters of those who are here. Of course, I don't know who actually is with us on the streaming. The book has got 3 parts, and the first part is an overview, a short introduction, and then 3 chapters by me and 1 by Joanne. And the one by Joanne is sort of programmatic chapter, whereas the 3 by me are more a sort of analysis. I must admit, research done during the first lockdowns. This is when we're talking about these chapters being written. In many cases, for various reasons, it's taken longer to publish. And so the first chapter I wrote is this one on the history of city museums. Funnily enough, nobody's ever written a history yet. There's a French book called Le Musée de Ville, Jean-Louis Postula, but it's not really a proper history. It's just mainly about Paris and Brussels museums, which were great founding city museums of the 1880s. But there's a lot of museums. You can't read all of these, but I've listed in the chapter all the museums and their founding dates since the beginning of the 19th century. And so it's far from just Brussels and Paris. There's heaps of museums of this kind founded. And as far as I know, this is the first time it's ever been, anybody's ever written any of this down. And even though this is what you might call superficial research, because it was done from websites, it wasn't done in the way that I would accept from a PhD student. So you can see, I hope with these, the first 4 museums were in some sense, because it's a matter of how you define a foundation, Riga, Leeds, London and Ghent. But then you see that the big heartland of city museums is Germany. I don't know whether on the streaming we've got either of our German authors here, but really the 1860s, 70s, 80s, all Germans, many of the big German cities set up city museums. That's not to say there weren't some in other areas, in England, in Belgium, France, but Germany took the lead really all the way up to the First World War. If we look at the situation now, you find that most bigger cities have city museums in Europe. I did a survey of all the larger cities over 400,000 population, and only 14 of the 75 didn't have city museums. So there are national differences, which I won't go into. I do go, and I don't go into it now as to what's really going on. Why were these founded? What's somebody really trying to do in setting up a museum? But I go into that because nobody's really done the research in this area. There's a big project that did national museum studies in 2012, funded by the European Union, but something similar on city museums has not been done. The next 2 chapters, and I'm sorry to say, is going to be a progression through the book. I'm not going to start jumping around for you. It's just going to be straightforward. Look at the situation of transformation of the museums, because that's what we've been finding in the network, that we're really in the midst of a period of dramatic transformation of this sort of museum. You may start expressing skepticism or wondering why this is going on, or what is going on. But to establish the simple facts that on the left you've got the is it your left? Yes, your left is Stuttgart, a new museum opened 5 years ago, and on the right is Bordeaux, the Musée de l'Aquitaine, which is totally renovated, new presentations by the that director is a member of our network, and Stuttgart is not a member of the network. And so, again, I've got slides of this sort of outpouring of new and renovated museums since the 1990s, which you can't read, but this one you probably can read if your glasses are on. And you'll see since 2010, which is really where this took off, there's new foundings all over the place. Some are new foundations absolutely from scratch, and some are most are renovations or rebuildings or something like that. So I mean, Cardiff, Dublin, Kassel, Volos and Zurich are all new, whereas the other ones are all refoundations. And there's more coming along. So something has to be explained. Why are people investing so much in museums? Vienna, sort of book your visit to Vienna Museum probably early next year. I should think the works will be finished by then. They've doubled the size of the already a very substantial city museum. Lyon is about halfway through. London, I'll say a bit more when we get to the chapter on that. Hamburg is a massive investment scheme supported by the federal government to make a new port museum in Hamburg, but also renovate all the existing city museum, which is well established. Munich, these are both enormous projects. Hamburg and Munich, talking about £200 million, something of that order. Far bigger than the sort of investment I'm sure that's happening here. And Amsterdam is also in the midst of changing. So this is just a few of the museums which are investing at the moment. So Ghent was 2010, and Vienna is on the way, is on site, has been on site for 3 or 4 years. So far more detail in the chapters, but obviously that's enough for this evening from my chapters. This is Joanne's, what I described as a programmatic chapter. In other words, this is a result of Joanne's work over 15 years, really, and his developing international contacts and international positions. And it really forms a very strong set of conclusions. I expect he would say provisional conclusions about how city museums, where they're going, where they should be going. So he comments on in sort of a slightly parallel to me, but much briefer, about the trajectories of museum change, about urban history being the disciplinary basis, he feels, the right to the city, so he's bringing in the politics, the value orientation, and the importance of museums to urban economies as well. So there's all sorts of issues coming in from Joanne's analysis there. So that's the first part. The second part of the book is takes 6 network members, museums, and shows, within relatively few pages, but with quite a lot of images, what's been going on in the transformation. There's very widely differing in terms of budgets and how much physical change, and where they've got to. 2 are finished and 4 are work in progress. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides on each of the 6 museums, just to sort of take you on a tour. The people here probably know the MUBAR changes and know that we're in the midst of a sort of opening period at the moment. And so I've just taken 2 of the more sort of graphic images, and which in a way show that each of the chapters picks up some of the points that are going to be coming in part 3, which is the themes section of the book. So this slide might be seen as establishing some sort of narrative for the way in which MUBAR presents itself to the city, and how the different bits of MUBAR add up to a whole, which they've been working on a lot in the last few 2 or 3 years. And the second image I'll show from the Mubar chapter is the Bezos axis, which takes in a lot of the big investments, which you will know being inaugurated, the Housing Museum in Bon Pastor a couple of weeks ago, the Fabrique Haute, the Museum of Work last week, and the Water Museum next on Saturday, and Olivier Artes, which is already functioning. So these 4 bits of this axis, which is Mubar's put a big effort into. I should say, actually, at this chapter, although it's got Joan Rocca's name at the top, it's with the members of the Mubar team. So it's a sort of expressive of the collaborative approach to working in Mubar. There's far more there, but it will take me down too much time to say a lot about each of these cases. So I'll move on to the chapter by Paul Spies, who's the director at the Stadtmuseum Berlin, and he's been up to his neck in this transformation process since he was appointed from Amsterdam to Berlin in 2015, I think. This is a view of the existing classic Märkisches Museum, Berlin City Museum, built as a museum in 1908. It's a fantastic building, but it needs changing, and it's being changed. And it's going to be changed very extensively by addition of areas around it. A great big building called the Marine House is going to be brought in as a sort of urban laboratory associated with the Museum for Creative activities in range. What I'm trying to present with these 6 museums is that each is going along slightly different paths, and that's the value of the network, that you can learn ideas from the other creativity being expressed in different circumstances in each city. So Paul Spies has been challenged by this existing very fantastic building, but what do you do with a fantastic purpose-built museum? You've got to think, and so he's extending out into neighbouring buildings and into the surrounding area, the sort of quarter. And that's another feature that you'll see coming through, that you don't just think about the museum building, you think about the quarter that it's in. And so if Paul was here, he would explain all of those details. He also explains the principles that he's working on with obviously the Senate politicians of Berlin, very open approach, very social consciousness being Berlin. And this other part of his job is presenting a new exhibition in a thing called the Humboldt Forum, which is a great big new building in the middle of, rebuilt Royal Palace, but it's really new. It just looks like the old Royal Palace. Within it is a set of museums, and part of that is a thing called Berlin Global. And so it's the idea that Berlin is a very important city connecting to a lot of bits of the world, which I think is a very interesting idea. And it's you can get the images on the web of all of these extraordinary rooms that they've set up in Berlin Global, which are part of the History Museum of Berlin, although they're physically separate in another new building. And that opened 18 months ago. So he's been very busy and that process will take, I think, another 3 or 4 years to come to full fruition. We moved to the third one in Copenhagen. This is Vivi Anderson and Jacob Parby's chapter. Both work in the museum at Copenhagen. It was out on the edge of, out of the city centre of Copenhagen for many years. And they took the decision about 5 years ago to move it to the city centre. And it's now right near the other big museums in Copenhagen. And what you'll see here is a very full description of how they decided, what criteria they used. The images are beautiful. I think they show terrific design capacity to present museum rooms beautifully. I think the two images I've chosen here. One of the emphases is one on urban planning, which I naturally picked up, that they say that one of the points of a museum, they think, is to make citizens be able to understand how the city is changing. So they've got lots and lots of maps and models. This second image shows this model where they're using the latest technology, digital technology, with layering on models and maps, which many museums are now doing, to let people play around with what's happening, see what's happening in the city. So, because Copenhagen is unusual, it actually is not only a museum, it also is the heritage office for the city council. So it deals with old buildings. So they have to know what's going on in heritage. So the museum has a sort of interesting crossover role there, where it's actually an administrator and decider as well as a presenter of the museum. So that's opened in February 2020. Not brilliant timing either, but still they opened just before the pandemic to great acclaim, and apparently vast numbers of people going to the new museum before they then couldn't go to the museum for a long time. Coming on to Frankfurt, Jan Gerschau, the director there, has explained how their team worked to open this museum in 2017. This was a modernist building of 1972, and it got unpopular like some modernist buildings do, so they rebuilt it with a good-sized budget, some very fine buildings, I think. It's partly an old castle, the Salhof, you can't see that in this image, and then there's a new building. And this chapter is really about innovation, because the museum's got a lot of innovative elements, a new museum within it. There's one called the Snow Globe, which gives sort of cliche type typical images of Frankfurt that people have in their mind, and then plays around with what those ideas are in an extraordinary sort of creation. And there's another one which is the model up on the top floor of the museum, where some Dutch artist company has taken mental maps of people. In other words, they asked a lot of people, what do you think is the three most important things in Frankfurt? They wrote them down, and then they sort of created a sort of imaginary map. So it's not like an exact map. It's got the things that people notice and think of, and people love this. There's sort of always lots of people up there, as far as I could see when I was there. So Jan, I think, has done a fine job in describing this sort of innovative process that they went through for trying to sort of refresh in every way the presentation of the museum. Museum of Lisbon is doing some of the same thing. Joanna Sousa, as director, gives this as a sort of museum on a path on a pathway, I think. I'm forgetting my exact title, but the transformation of the main centre is the image you can see here, which is just outside Lisbon centre. Beautiful building and lovely gardens, which there's a lot of scope for change, and they're changing all of the exhibitions and changing garden areas as well. And then the temporary exhibitions, Joanna's a great fan of using anthropologists and engaging with current issues. So they'll, for example, they did a temporary exhibition on vegetable gardens in Lisbon. So they would go and talk to all the vegetable gardeners, the allotment gardeners, many of whom come from all sorts of parts of the world, particularly Portuguese ex-colonies, and then compare that with gardens and allotment areas that go right back into Lisbon's history. So that technique is another one that's sort of an innovative approach, actually used by some other museums these days as well. And then there was an exhibition, temporary exhibition on futures, which naturally appealed to me because it was curated by an urban planner and an architect. And it thought about what Lisbon specialists had invented in terms of the future of Lisbon in the past, if you see what I mean. In other words, we're always thinking about futures, and by looking at the way people have imagined the city in the past, they made a very interesting exhibition attached to lots of lectures and discussion meetings like this one. Finally, of these 6 museums, not finally of my presentation, Museum of London. This is a big beast. It was built, again, the same modernist period, 1976, in the Barbican, if those of you who've been to London. But again, it got unpopular and it closed in December last year. Very sad, really, because it was still a fantastic museum. And they're moving, as you can see on this map, I hope, about 600 yards, 600 metres, to the old wholesale markets of London, which are owned by the City of London. And so that will be, the building work will start soon, and 3 years' time, you'll be able to go to London and see the new Museum of London. So Glyn Davis, the man in charge of the new exhibitions, has explained the whole process, the criteria, the principles, the public involvement in terms of promoting the new museum. There's still another bit of the London Museum of Docklands will remain open while this one is closed, so they haven't disappeared completely. But this will be, I think, it's a big project, as I say, 200 million plus, I believe, is the budget, and it's paid for partly by the City of London, which is the old Central Area Corporation, and partly by the Mayor of London, which is the proper London of 9 million people. So there's been an interesting balance between the two. Are we doing for time? Can I continue? Good, right. I don't want to wear you out. Well, I will wear you out, but hopefully not too much, because Joanne will want to say something, I'm sure, as well. So that's the view of the Museum of London and the new, as it were, the old markets renovated and built up as a new museum. And they have been in the forefront, I think, the Museum of London, dealing with difficult issues, all the big sort of controversial issues that we have in Britain as elsewhere, decolonisation and so on, slave trade and things like that. So the last section of the book is on themes, and the network entrusted the editors with covering a number of themes. And then we had the job of finding authors, which meant that the authors basically could have some leeway, because we couldn't really dictate to them what they were going to do, although obviously we made some suggestions. So they're very differing approached on these different themes, but they're all issues that are live if you're running a museum as to what you do about some of these things. The first one is research, which is clearly key. You've got to get a reasonably good basis for any exhibition you do or any work you do. And this is one of our sort of slightly heroic figure. Jan Gershow wrote a second chapter, so he wrote the research going on in the Frankfurt Museum. So there's a sort of double dose of Frankfurt here. And what you see is that there's all sorts of different sorts of research. Some is done in-house, in his case, say specialist, an exhibition on women's clothing, fashion changes, or on another one in-house on provenance. There's a big issue where goods objects came from during the Nazi period, what happened on provenance. There's other forms of research done by university researchers, in other words, collaboration with universities. And then finally, there's what he calls citizen science. And one of the great innovations of Frankfurt is to go out into different areas of the city, what they call the city lab. And they work with communities, and then they bring the discoveries, whatever those may be, from varying different areas, back into the museum and create exhibitions on that basis. And that's, Jan, I think quite rightly argues, is also research. It's just a different sort of research. So there's a range of collaborative and research bases for museums. there's 2 chapters on narratives because we found that the 2 authors, instead of writing a joint chapter, Glyn Davis from London, and Michał Wisniewski, which I probably pronounced wrong, from Krakow, they wrote separate chapters, which I think work well because we've got a sort of UK basis of examples: Liverpool, London, Cardiff. This one is a picture of this is Cardiff. In other words, a sort of identity question that you can ask people when they come to a museum. What is your idea of this city of Cardiff? Glyn picks up many of the issues around these big issues that I've mentioned, decolonisation as one of them, as well as examining the way in which, for example, Liverpool Museum set up about 4 different sort of titles which show how they established a narrative in Liverpool, which one was called the People's Republic, that people in Liverpool are famous for creating trouble, rebelling. I saw the same in Nottingham. They've got the same theme in the new Nottingham Museum. It's called Nottingham Rebellions, I think is one of the title of the narrative they chose. So you can present your city as having certain characteristics, but obviously it's a very definite choice, and you've got to be careful about what narrative approach you choose. This is Michał's Polish chapter, and here he shows how this extraordinary country, Poland, is been working hard to create new narratives in the last 20 years, with some success, I think Michał would say, although it's very hard work. So he shows, for example, the extraordinary museum in Wrocław, which was, I think, Wrocławia and then Breslau, and it's been in 7 different countries. It was first in Poland, then in about 5 different countries, and now it's back in Poland again. And you think of setting up a narrative for that in a museum, how you present that, quite a challenge. He then looks at the Krakow case, which deals particularly with issues around the Second World War and the Oskar Schindler factory. There's an emphasis there. And then he looks at the Polish Museum of the Polish Jews in Warsaw. And this is an image of part of that, the reconstruction of a synagogue. I think Michał's chapter is very, very good at drawing out how challenging creating narratives in quite a potentially conflictual set of interpretations can be, and how you try and work through those issues. Probably sharper, if anything, in Poland than most other places. Jetta Sandal, very, very experienced museum director, brought together examples from 7, I think, of the network members to show how collecting is done now. She says that we should be democratizing collecting, we should be completely changing our approach to collecting, and that this can help to cover up some of the blind spots, because museums traditionally, she says, have a sort of emphasis on those with power and wealth, and that's not necessarily the right way to do it if you're thinking of a sort of new democratic museum. So she looks at the different ways that collecting can be done, and that collections are obviously a core part of museums. So that she uses examples like this is an image of a boy on a swing in the pandemic. So, because a lot of museums started collecting things to do with the pandemic, and this is meant to express the sort of freedom that you could still get by going outside during the pandemic, as long as you were allowed to go outside. So, heritage, Ramon is actually here, so I'll have to be careful what I say. But Ramon Graus from the Polytechnic has produced a chapter which shows the use of a particular approach, a historical landscape approach to thinking about heritage areas and how city museums can learn from those. And he took some interesting examples from Barcelona, but also from other places. This is Toulouse on the screen, and showed the details of that in a box. So I'm really jumping over these theme chapters rather than explaining them properly, I'm sorry to say, but that heritage theme is very important because, of course, all museums are based in some area or another, and they interact with that area, and they also form a sort of part of a path for visitors who can then go out and look at the actual area around them or in the city in general. So there's a continuous interaction, and how you deal with patrimony, with heritage, is very important in museums. The digital chapter was really part of it, a chapter on formats, but Rosa Tamburino from Turin gave us a sort of tour of her work and of some of the different network museums' way of dealing with digital, which of course came even more to the forefront in the pandemic. So how do you deal with online museum and the on-site museum? That's what all museums are working through, but there are different ways of dealing with it. It's not an obvious answer. I mean, it's something you have to probably experiment with, see how people respond, and then change and so on. So Rosa took examples here. We've got an example of a digital exhibition, very strongly digital exhibition in the Museum of London, which was actually borrowed, I think, from an original exhibition in Paris. So there's sort of borrowing going on an explicit level as well as ideas sort of borrowing. Itinerating, again, Manuel Martin is here. So he's an expert, one of the products of Barcelona is special because it's got a master's in leading tours of cities. And it shows this idea that you actually, although we've all done tours of cities, or most of us have probably, we're not necessarily doing them as well as we might do. And by setting up the masters, I think Mubar with the universities has shown, again, innovating and shown a thing that could be picked up elsewhere. Manel takes examples as well from other cities which do. Almost every city museum will have some link, or could have some link to organising itineraries, and he also picks up his own speciality of water and gives a useful example of how you sort of create an itinerary and how it relates to other parts of the history of the area that they're going through. So we're nearly there on the themes. This is the last one, Participatory Museum. Paul van der Laar from Rotterdam shows us how you can, developing a radical approach to bringing people into museums and going out into communities, which I've already mentioned, can develop. And from 2005, Rotterdam made a big point of this and set up all sorts of projects. There was one called the Panorama Project. There was one called the New Collecting Project. And there's another one called Authentic Heritage, which is what this one is, which is a picture of a Bulgarian workers in Rotterdam who used to drive back to Bulgaria every summer or whenever it was when their work ran out. And they presented their cars, and they... So they built an exhibition around these Bulgarian cars. It's just a way of connecting with people who possibly had nothing to do with the museum before, and possibly people in Rotterdam didn't know much about. This is unfortunately not a happy ending, because eventually from 2013 onwards, the authorities of Rotterdam Council started cutting the budget dramatically. And in the end, the museum was not able to do a full museum job. And there was actually a very interesting exhibition when I was there about 5 years ago. of still managing. But in the end, of 2020, the City Council said, we've run out of money, we're going to have to close most of the museum. And that's where it stands at the moment. And it's in a debating process, I believe, as to how the new museum will be created, if it is created. Because really, you can't have a city like Rotterdam without a city museum. I think it's fairly unthinkable for many people in Rotterdam, but obviously there's financial questions around that. But there's a very honest and interesting chapter about what happens when you go into strongly participatory mode. You may have difficulties with some support, or I don't know. The story is complicated, but it may be a slightly downbeat chapter to end the book with. But that's the way it worked out. So 3 slides to go, and then I'm finished. The one conclusion is fairly obvious, that these museums are very, very different, and that should, in theory, support the argument that's been the network has had, is you can learn from each other. Episodes of innovation, which I've been stressing, are available for people to pick up from other places. Obviously not to copy, but to be inspired by. And it might be good if there was some sort of public support for that learning, but even somebody like the EU with a bit of money coming in, but still that's not so likely. Made me think perhaps a contrast is with football teams, which gradually used to probably play in completely different ways, and over the recent decades, now the players move around Europe all the time and they learn different styles. And maybe there's scope for a sort of museum transfer scheme or something with staff swapping from one museum to another. Anyway, that's just a thought that came to me when I was writing this slide. This is just an image, because I like the title. I don't like the book, but Seeing Like a City, I think what is needed really, in my perspective, is more confidence from cities, confidence that they can actually do something, not that all the things they can't do, because there's a lot of things cities can't do. States do it and other people do it, but cities can do quite a lot. And this idea of seeing, in other words, changing your perspective and your focus on to the city level, I think is one thing which is relevant. And that suggests to me there's an enormous scope for new museums to be set up. I showed you that some cities don't have city museums, even big cities, and for making the existing ones more relevant. And I'll finish with this phrase about the foundational economy. This is an idea from, in academic parlance these days, that every city is, okay, it has a sort of export base like a car factory or a financial sector, but it also has the normal things that we have to live with. We schools and hospitals and ordinary shops and things, which is what people are now saying is actually just as important as the rest of the economy, and they call it the foundational economy. And it seems to me you can make a case that city museums should be part of that. In other words, they're not like art museums, which are sort of a separate sort of cultural zone. They're something which ties into the everyday functioning of the city, and they're also relevant to steering the future of the city, in other words, the functioning of democracy. So I think there's a strong case to be made for city museums, which possibly, I'm sure museum directors make it, but I don't sure whether politicians necessarily always get the message. So I think this book needs to be part of that sort of discussion, and hopefully if it gets around the place and is distributed a bit and even sold a bit, and then it will help in that process. So thank you for listening to me in my hopefully comprehensible English for so long, and I'm very happy to obviously invite Joanne to come up here and join in, and because he's the other editor after all, and then we can have maybe a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this clear and complete presentation. Now? Yes. Thank you very much, Tim, for this clear and complete presentation of a big book, which will be, I think, really important in the coming years. As you said, we have been meeting for more than 12, now 13 years to get it. And I think that the last sentence you have here is really the most important one. City museums can make a case to be foundational because they can be an important part of the steering mechanism of cities. Now, in our museum, Barcelona, we are preparing the EMEA convention, the European Museum of the Year Award convention, at the beginning of May. Yeah. And the crucial question for all museums is the question of democracy. And one of the speakers, we were talking those days, will talk about museums, democracy, and Europe. Well, I think that that's what city museums can do in even a stronger way than other museums, because they are rooted in the city. And, well, after all, the city network, not only in Europe, can be the best structure for dialogue to enhance and to reinforce democracy when states and new empires are fighting. After all, cities are the place of everyday life and are the place where you meet the different scales. And I think that this book really helps not to miss the point. City museums were, in the faraway past, the place of the big city with big heritage. Then, under the idea of participation and proximity, many city museums went to neighborhood, proximity. If we only take neighborhood and proximity, we lose the capacity of breaking mechanisms, of breaking limits. In the same way that if we only took the city and big heritage, we could not talk both and at the same time about the city and about the citizens. City and citizens at the same time. So I think that city museums can be a very important institution for the future. And not only for Europe. For example, now in MUBA, which is one of the museums that he is somewhat explained, that which really try to enhance this network, we are thinking about cities in other continents. Imagine that after all, a city museum is much cheaper than other institutions as a meeting place of ideas rooted in objects and documents, which after all show that you are not creating a fake narrative. You have some elements of witnesses. And city museums can be very powerful. That's why last year in the ICOM-CAMAC meeting in Barcelona, we talked about the minimal city museum, like the minimum dwelling, minimal city museum. What could be the minimum, not minimal, minimum, you told me, minimum city museum to enhance a narrative from the suburbs to the city center, or from the city center to the suburbs, or in a polycentric structure. Now with internet and digital means, it's quite easy to organize a single museum rooted in different places in the city. That's not the same before. You needed much more energy and much more organization. So I think that that can be useful in the whole of the world. And these thoughts about the city museums in Europe, which had a quite long tradition, as in other continents. Like in America, they have a quite long tradition, and in other places. So puts at stake what you said in your last sentence. An institution that important part of the steering mechanism of cities. But to do that, it's important, as is stated in the different chapters of the book, to do research. But not to split research. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. Look, the other museums, technical museums, they have a paradigm established in universities, technology. Science museums, the same. Art museums have a kind of canon or anti-canon. Doesn't matter. They have a clear way to dialogue with reality through different kinds of objects and through different kinds of explanations. City museums must do their own research because there are city studies, but it's not so common to have a quite well-structured line of city studies in a city. Barcelona has the privilege of being a big city, being a capital without having a state, being a metropolis which is plurimunicipal and has to think a lot about all those things. And perhaps that's why in Barcelona there was a line of urban studies rooted in city history, which we want to continue. Because if you can think at the same time in different moments through the city history, going through different neighborhoods, and having a comparative point of view with different cities, you are free to place yourself in the world. We talk about literature, about music, about many different mechanisms. To them we have a Weltanschau, a point of view about the world. If you are able to read the landscape, to read the institutions to the landscape, to read is a metaphor, people to the streets, you can really take a lot of profit of the single fact of living in the city. You can go to another city and to understand your city and the reverse. So city museums, if they have a clear of the idea, excuse me, my terrible English, after Tim, that's a disaster, but I do what I can. If we have a clear idea of research to explain the city through time and space, that's essential. We can really have a clear idea of how through objects, through dialogues, through walks, itinerating, we can really have a prescription, we said those days. So to say, a different way of talking about tourism, talking about education, and talking about politics. And that's it. And what makes this book different from other books is that until now, city museums, the idea is how to be interesting, participative, local, fantastic. Okay? But what is important is that from research to heritage to citizens and citizenship, there can be a clear path of thought to renew the Enlightenment, a much more rooted Enlightenment in the 21st century, so that city museums can do their job, steering the cities and city democracy. That's why we are so happy. I have been so happy to share with Tim, because his Catalan is better than my English. So we usually talk in Catalan, to talk with Tim about all these chapters made by people that now know each other, and we know all of us very well, and that perhaps this book can be a first big step to continue thinking about city museums in cities. Yes, from Europe, but looking around the world. That's what I could say after your systematic lecture that would not have been able to do, because yes, Tim, that's thanks to you that you really did what I here tell that it has to be done. A systematic approach to have the freedom to read it in a very different ways. Because it's a book, you can read it in very different ways. That's a good book. It has not a single reading or a single way of putting things. It's a complex book, but quite clear to understand. So, well, that's what I can add to what you said.
Could I just add, before, because I made one great large omission which needs to be done, which is to thank the authors. I think my presentation implicitly thanked the authors, but I should say explicitly that obviously it's down to them that the books appeared, Ramon and Manel here, but there's a few others, I think, I hope, on the streaming. But also the collaborators, because it's not just the authors. The MUBAR team has had some very important roles in this, and I must pick out two people. Elena Perez, she's not here, but she's a very reliable and strong collaborator in the early and middle stages, very, very helpful. And Jaume Capsada has done a fantastic job of transforming the texts and images into this. So thank you, Jaume, for that. So, you know, again, collaborative effort, but thanks to all of you.
Especially thank the authors, hello, if you are there, because that has not been conceived as a commercial book. So they did it because they wanted to do it, and they wrote and then have written again, it said, no, until we got it all together. Yes.
I wonder if there's any of the
Yeah.
people on the streaming want to work to speak.
They can
as well
participate, I think,
as
isn't
well as
it?
individuals here.
By the way, we should not forget to say that thanks to, well, the modern ways of distribution, you can get it from La Central through internet. They can send the book to you through different very well-known commercial distribution companies, which are not to be mentioned, but you know, all of you, which the one is the most common there. Yes, from the website of MUBA, you can go through La Central and to ask for the book, isn't it? There was a PowerPoint to tell you how, but we decided finally we will find it. It's amusing to find a way.
Okay.
Questions? But also questions if someone is in streaming and wants to talk.
There are no questions?
Is there someone all over the world who wants to talk? Because, as you perhaps have already said, we are connected with ICOM CAMOC. We are connected with the United States. And we know that there is some people which are connected from other countries outside Europe. So what I said is real. So if someone of you from other cities or other continents wants to participate, I think it's possible, isn't it? So let's go.
Brian, pueden participar desde el streaming, pueden hacer preguntas por chat y se las respondemos.
Yeah. Yo,
Si hay alguna, me lo dices.
you have, if there is any question. For example, we have here, I think, Glenn, the president of CAMOC, who perhaps is connected, but 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Oh, that's not good for America, I think, but anyway.
Agradecimientos a ti. ¿Quién lo pone esto? ¿Quién lo pone? Anne-Marie de Wild from Amsterdam, I think. Thanks to Tim Marshall.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Really, he deserves to be, we must be really grateful for his great job. So thanks, Anne-Marie. Have a nice
¿Alguna más,
afternoon
Brian?
in Amsterdam.
No, nada más.
So, Anne-Marie, here we have it. Last time we met in Bezos. So, next time perhaps we meet in Amsterdam.
Some questions here in the venue? No one?
Your speech was so clear and the book is so comprehensible that I think that there are no more questions. Do you add something?
No, I mean, I think I probably exhausted people, and I'm very grateful to all of you for coming as well. So that seems to be it, I think. Have a look at the book and see eventually at some point and see what you think. I should be interested to have any feedback on the content.
Yes, especially because the second edition is coming.
No.
Oh my God.
Okay? So, bye-bye.
No sabem quin havia, no?
No,
Perfecte.
¿Dónde están las preguntas? ¿Anne-Marie de Bill? Well, me oyen? Can you hear me?
Yes?
Yes, okay. Anne-Marie de Bild, Tim, did you look at the mapping city museum projects of Camok?
Yes, now.
Is that on? It's working? Yeah. Yes, the question is, did I look at the Mapping City Museums of Camok project? I'm aware of it, and I mean, Joanna and others have mentioned it to me, but I haven't heard about the results yet, so the answer is no. I should have mentioned it. I think that's going to be a useful source of information in the future. If you can tell me any more, please do.
Well, perhaps we should explain to all the people that one of the most important projects which Camok is now finishing,
Camok is the World Association of City Museums.
yes, is this mapping of city museums. Because the first thing to be done to talk about the question is how many city museums are there in the world. So this is a very important project of Camok. Camok has a board of people who is leading the organization, and Camok meets every year. If you are interested, next meeting is in New York next September. But you can find in the webpage the exact days. So it will be a very interesting meeting too.
Well, there are another question by Anne-Marie de Bilt too. What are the next research steps worldwide?
Next research steps of what?
Next research steps worldwide.
Anna-Marie, we have to decide it together. You're part of both networks, the City History Museum Research Network, Museum Research and Museums Network of Europe, and CAMOC ICOM. So we have to decide it together in our next meetings, CAMOC, and also in Barcelona, the City Hist Network. Isn't it? But he has a better answer than me.
I don't have a better answer, no. I mean, my only thought is that Joanne very much represents the importance of keeping in touch with academic work on urban history, which I very much agree with. But there are other areas of academic work which I think can be helpful in terms of research and urban sociology, which may sound very sort of 1970s and out of date, but in actual fact there's a new efflorescence, a new sort of wave of work in urban critical theory, critical urban theory and urban sociology, which is pouring out interesting new ideas. So I think there's plenty of areas for interaction with between city museums and the academic world. Because I'm an academic, I would say that, but I don't think, having seen the background of people in the City History Network, that they're necessarily up to date with that sort of thing, because it's not their job, they're running museums. But I think there's a lot more scope for interaction across the social and even economic areas of study, as not just urban history.
To give a calendar, in May, the EMEA Awards, this is all museums, incredible. We organized many visits of the city. The most accepted and tours will be the urban tours. People coming, people from all kinds of museums decided that urban tours from a city museum were a very important way of doing. So that's among professionals. Second, you talked about academic research. We will meet in CAMOC in New York in September, in Barcelona City Hist at the end of the year, but in 2024 in Ostrava and 2026 in Barcelona, the European Association for Urban History will meet. So here in this place, in 2026, I think, because there will be a lot of things at the same time, we'll have some presentations about urban history rooted to the city museums. That's the first time that this organization, which always meets in a university, will go to a city museum. So, Anna-Marie and all other people will have a lot of work. Yes?
Anna-Marie, give another question. 2024, but it's not a question, it's an apportation. 2024 CAMOC conference will be in Amsterdam, theme Collecting the City.
Did you hear it? 2024. Then there will be night trains direct to Amsterdam from Barcelona, from many cities in Europe and from the whole of the world. I don't know if they come by plane or, but we will be there for sure, Anna-Marie. So if we don't meet before, we will be in Amsterdam, I think. Yeah.
That's all.
That's a family, as you can see. Yeah. Passi-ho bé i bona nit, bones tardes.